Hello everyone. I'm going to introduce our course to you by telling you a little bit about the fascinating life of our main character, Virginia Woolf. Woolf was one of the most important and influential modernists, a most prolific writer, whose connections to important thinkers and writers placed her at the center of early 20th century thought. Virginia Woolf was the daughter of Julia Princep Jackson Stephen and Leslie Stephen. Before Virginia's birth, each of her parents were married, had children, and was widowed. Julia Jackson, who came from a family of fabled beauties, was first married to a man named Herbert Duckworth, with whom she had 3 children, George, Stella, and Gerald, who was born after his father's sudden death. Julia was devastated by this loss. She was only 24 years old when her husband died. Meanwhile, Leslie Stephen had married William Makepeace Thackeray's daughter Minnie and had one daughter, Laura, who was never quite right. Minnie became ill after the birth, dying about 5 years later. Both those households were plunged in grief for many years. Julia occupied her time with good works, and one day her charitable impulses led her to Leslie Stephen's house. Leslie just wanted to moan about his bad fortune, and Julia provided a sympathetic ear. After several years of this, they married and had 4 children of their own: Vanessa, Toby, Virginia, and Adrian. The parents raised this large family of teenagers and infants in a big, dark, rambling house at 22 Hyde Park Gate, a cul-de-sac near, you guessed it, Hyde Park. Julia toted one or more of her babies along with her on charitable visits. Various grown-ups took them to the park next door to run off some energy, and the 4 younger children bonded with each other, sometimes against the older generations with whom they shared their house, their elderly parents and their much older half-siblings. In the summer, beginning when Virginia was still a tiny baby, the family left the heat of London for the more salubrious air of St. Ives, Cornwall. In this remote fishing village buffeted by the Atlantic Ocean, the children fished and swam and played cricket and collected interesting insects. We will learn more about Julia Stephen when we read Woolf's book on being ill. Julia was a member of an important family whose daughters were known for their beauty, although one of her aunts is one of the most famous photographers of the 19th century. Julia herself downplayed her looks. You can see from her photographs that she generally dressed severely and pulled her hair back sharply, looking older than she was. She had fallen deeply in love at first sight of her first husband and thought his death was punishment, or alternatively, that the lesson to learn is that life is short and unimportant. Throughout Woolf's childhood, she spent most of her time, although she was running a very large household, taking care of a demanding husband, and bearing children every year or two, working as a nurse to the poor. She visited, brought food, took care of their illnesses, and advised them on how to rectify their failures. She died when Virginia was just 13. Virginia thought, from being exhausted from all the demands on her time and energy. Leslie Stephen was older than his wife. Like her, he was well connected. He had studied at Cambridge, then taught there for a bit, but left due to not wanting to take holy orders, a requirement for professors at that time. He ended up as a sort of public intellectual, and was the first editor of that great Victorian project, the Dictionary of National Biography. Leslie was going deaf during the course of their marriage, and he was a legendary complainer. After Julia's death, he had even more to complain about, and one couldn't say that he was a kind or supportive father to his young children after their mother's death. Interestingly, though both Leslie and Julia Stephen were raised as Anglicans, as was typical for ruling-class English people, they both became atheists after the deaths of their spouses, so the 8 Duckworth-Stephen children were raised outside the church. In this image of Virginia Stephen at age 20, 7 years after her mother's death and 2 years before her father's, we can see that she did inherit the beauty of the famous Jackson sisters. She was wholly uninterested in that, though. She wanted to write. Unfortunately for her, her father and her elder half-brothers prevented her. Her father, after the deaths of Julia and her daughter Stella, who died about 2 years after her mother, became one loud groan machine. Woolf would later remember him in her writing. Every month, someone had to take the household accounts for him to inspect, and every month he would groan in agony that the household was killing him. Woolf wrote that as much as he needed to complain, he needed a woman to complain to, someone who would soak up his groans in her sympathy, thus reassuring him of his importance. Meanwhile, her 2 elder half-brothers, who had inherited money from their father, wanted to make a splash in the social life of London and had 2 very attractive sisters to take around from party to party, in hopes that one of them would make a good marriage and thus elevate the family's importance. As you might imagine, none of this was pleasing to either Virginia or her elder sister Vanessa, who wanted to be a painter. After Leslie Stephen's death, the 4 younger Stephen siblings abandoned 22 Hyde Park Gate and their Duckworth half-brothers, renting a home in Bloomsbury, the neighborhood near the British Museum, which is a nice neighborhood now, but a cheap and artsy place then. Friends of her brothers from Cambridge, as well as an assortment of writers, artists, and relatives, visited them there, becoming known as the Bloomsbury Group. Among the members were the writer E.M. Forster, the economist John Maynard Keynes, and the artist Clive Bell. Leonard Woolf, an inspiring writer who knew the Stephen brothers from Cambridge, also came around. Leonard and Virginia married in 1912. By this time, Virginia's brother Toby had died after a trip with his siblings to Greece, and Vanessa had married Clive Bell and moved to the country to paint. Leonard and Virginia Woolf rented a house and installed a printing press in the basement, a present from Leonard to Virginia that he hoped would help her with recurrent episodes of illness. Woolf's best biographer, Hermione Lee, is careful to note that we do not know what Woolf suffered from, but whatever it was rooted in the body. The onset of a spell of illness was always predicted by high fever. If you look around the internet for 5 minutes, you will see many speculative diagnoses of her condition. I would caution you to be careful about accepting any of these at face value. When Virginia Woolf's mother died, when she was 13, her father thought she was grieving too much, and so he sent her to the country to get treatment for hysteria, which at that time meant at least 6 weeks in bed in a dark room, no visitors, no reading or writing or any other stimulation, and a diet of milk. Unfortunately, this treatment, which we would now define as torture, creates most of the symptoms Woolf was known to have. Thus, with no way to know where the fevers came from or what other symptoms accompanied them besides the ones caused by her treatment, we really have no way to understand what Woolf was experiencing. With the exception of Woolf's first 2 books, both published by her half-brother Gerald Duckworth, Woolf published the rest of her first editions at the Hogarth Press, with dust jacket illustrations by her sister Vanessa. Woolf's second and subsequent editions were published by Harcourt, an actual publisher where the type was set up by typesetters rather than by one of the most important writers of her age. Hogarth Press also published first editions by writers like E.M. Forster and T.S. Eliot, but they declined to publish James Joyce's Ulysses, a 700-page monster, on their basement press. Before Woolf began writing novels, she was well known for her essays. She published in important journals like The Times and The Nation, writing on topics like the works of other writers. As she became more confident as an essayist, she began to write about modernism itself, what it was trying to do, why it was necessary, what obligations its writers had, how readers should approach modernist texts. Woolf's very first novel, published in 1915, was The Voyage Out. It tells the story of a young woman raised in constricted circumstances who journeys to South America, where her father is pursuing some business. There she encounters some young men and enters into an engagement with one of them before dying of a fever. This novel, conventional in many ways, is actually Woolf's first approach to breaking down the marriage plot, traditionally the only kind of novel a young woman was allowed to write. As Woolf became more successful, The Woolfs bought a place in the country, Monk's House in Sussex, where Virginia could write in quiet, and eventually where they could be safer once World War II started and the Nazis began to bomb London. Monk's House is a museum now. You can visit and see where Woolf worked, and even the narrow bed she slept in at her country house. All of that is pretty interesting, as are all the things I didn't tell you in this short introduction. But we do need to ask why we should engage in this sustained look at Virginia Woolf's writing. First, Woolf is a central figure of literary modernism. She wrote modernist texts and also theorized modernism, and so she was very influential for other writers and thinkers from her day to ours. Second, Woolf is a central figure of feminism. She began to write in the period when women could first attend university, own property in their own right, and eventually take degrees, work in the professions, and vote. And third, Woolf is a central figure in narrative studies. If we want to understand how narrative works in the 20th and 21st centuries, we must read Virginia Woolf.